Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this LinkedIn Live. This is LinkedIn Live from Kemp Technologies, and we are going to be talking about unlocking the modern application experience and subtitle Fireside Chat with Industry Experts. And this should be a very interesting and really mostly unscripted conversation talking about some things. Again, the modern application, what it means, and where we are today and how it impacts our IT architectures and technologies. Real quick, couple housekeeping things. If you're in this live, you can add comments to ask questions, and we'll be happy to look at these questions and answer them during this conversation. And again, completely unscripted and very open to anything that y'all want to talk about. So again, LinkedIn Live, Kemp Live, Unlocking the Modern Application Experience. My name is Frank Yue. I'm the Principal Application Experience Architect for Kemp Technologies. And we have two very distinguished guests here in the IT industry. We have Rachel Berry and Ibrahim Quraishi. And I'll give you a couple minutes to let them introduce themselves. First, Rachel, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you, Frank. I used to be a product manager at places like Citrix and NVIDIA. So I've worked in the EUC industry for quite a long time. Now I'm a freelance independent consultant, again, still in the EUC and data center products. And I also do some journalism for Tech Target. Um, Recently, with the whole COVID situation, I've been working with quite a lot of education customers who've suddenly had a big switch, which is how I've moved in more into the kind of load balancer ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. And Ibrahim, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Ibrahim. I'm a V expert, 2020, a blogger, a YouTuber, and I have worked in different organizations. Used to work for telecommunications, for BlackBerry in the past, for Orange, if you guys know that still. And currently I work for Bank of England. I'm a VMware evangelist, so I do a lot around VMware products. And happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both for joining us. And let me start all this conversation by first kind of defining what do we mean when we say modern application? Because I think this is important. And I always do this when I have conversations with people is number one, I want to set a baseline. I want us to all have the same definition for something because, for example, if I say cloud or if I say software defined networking or software defined anything, I ask 10 people, I get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
So let's all have the same answer here before we have this conversation. So when we talk about this modern application, my definition, and I think the definition we want to use is this concept of this application model evolving and when I say evolving, looking historically back in the old days, we had this kind of monolithic application beast. And I say beast in the nicest of ways, where we had these large centralized computing technologies like the mainframes and everything else, and we ran things where it was one big application that was coded that had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of lines of code, and it did everything. And then we started breaking things up where we started doing some things where we started doing back in the IBM days, referring back to how old I am and everything. We had things that we call the FEP, front end processor. In today's world, this would be the HTTP web interface. And then we had the middleware. The middleware would have been your dynamic engine that does things, your BEA WebLogic, your .NET, your Cold Fusion, your ASP, your Node.js. And then we had the back end, which was kind of your database, the storage, the information, the data. And we had these three main components. And today we're really taking this concept of this application and we're kind of doing this. If you're a mechanical engineer, you have these diagrams which explode and have all the parts all over the screen, all over the page that show the gears and the cogs and all these little components. And that's what we're doing with the application, where we're taking all the different components and exploding them and making them their own little micro or mini application, if you want to call it that. These, what we now call in IT terms, we're calling these services and microservices. And we're using things like virtual machines and containers and all these things to define and create this modern application that is now exploded. Instead of the monolithic beast, we have these little tiny things. And this has really changed how we manage our IT architecture. This really has changed, and for better or worse, on what we're trying to do with this architecture and what we're trying to do with our applications. So let me start there and then kind of throw out to you. And Ibrahim, let's go to you first and say, what is happening with this modern application and why are we there and what does it mean to you today?
So the technology obviously has changed a lot since you mentioned the original monolithic application as a beast. So many vendors have taken the same approach. They are taking a single monolithic application and they are splitting it into microservers, as you said. So we could have a single server which has a web server and middleware and a database. Now we have to have 3 different servers doing individual servers doing the specific role of web server, of middleware, and also a dedicated server for SQL or whatever database you want. So, which is quite interesting. Now, this basically gives the ability for the administrator to update the code individually on the web servers and not getting not having a single point of failure when they update the code. So it takes a little bit more further, because now you just don't want one single web server as a single point of failure. You would now you can now spin up multiple web servers so that you have multiple targets to hit when your traffic comes in, and you can also have the ability of updating one server at a time and still have that resilience when you're doing updates, code changes, and all that. So it gives IT a little bit of agile, way of working. Which also I want to talk a little bit about how VMware basically did that. With the recent updates with VMware, they have decided to bake in Kubernetes to their flagship hypervisor vSphere 7, and with that, what they are doing now is they have baked in Kubernetes in the vSphere 7. They are now allowing DevOps person to directly integrate to the infrastructure and spin up their own workload. What that basically allows then is allows the developers to spin up their workload, and the administrator, on the other hand, to manage and maintain it and secure it at the same time. Along with that, VMware has built an entire SDDC wrapper around it, which they are now basically calling Cloud Foundation for. The beauty of this is now your application which you're running in your environment allows you to be built in-house on your environment. And because it is built with the standards of being cloud ready, you can migrate it to any cloud. It becomes cloud agnostic. So you can build it on VMware Cloud Foundation 4, and you can move it to AWS. You can move it to, Azure with I think there's a vendor who supports VMware with Azure, which is Cloud Simple, I think, if I'm correct. So you can use all that. Now, which brings us to an interesting question. So all these applications which we are spreading out in-house and on the cloud, they all need a complete load which needs to be pointed. It needs a load balancer which needs to be agnostic of a cloud, and it also needs a load balancer which is more geo-tracking aware, if that's the right word, right? It needs to be aware where the traffic is coming in, and it needs to direct that traffic to the right data center rather than sending the traffic to a different one. So I think if you can give a little bit around that, load balancer bit, which we can understand a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, Ibrahim. Excuse me. And thank you for that. You touched a lot of interesting points there. And I want to get to you, Rachel, in a second, but real quick about the load balancing pieces. Load balancing has always been important, I think, for many organizations to provide the availability, resiliency, security in terms of making sure applications exist, that the application capability is there. And this becomes even more important, obviously, with this concept of these services, microservices and containers, because now we have a lot more, basically, I'm going to call micro applications, if I can call it that. I don't know if that's a real term, but it is now. That we need to load balance. So there's a lot of pieces there. But you brought a lot of interesting points, Ibrahim, in terms of, number one, there's a lot of changes, obviously, with the explosion of these little services. Two, Kubernetes, you mentioned, which is an orchestration engine for containerized services, which is very important, and the whole integration with DevOps. And I wanted to come to you, Rachel, because I think you have a very interesting perspective with the work that you've done and the work you kind of currently do, especially like in the educational market space in the vertical. How does all these changes impact what happens with you and that vertical? And there are pros and cons to it all, right?
Yeah, and to some extent, I'm probably at the other end of the extreme to Ibrahim, where Ibrahim's working and worked in the market with like a lot of customers who've actually built these kind of applications up. Um, Particularly in the education sector at the moment, the type of customers I'm working with have some, they're pretty mainstream products. A lot of Microsoft, a lot of Google. Um, Suddenly, these kind of community colleges, further education colleges have suddenly had to go to a remote or a blended learning online teaching model. Um, for example, one customer I'm working with, they've got a lot of Microsoft 365 kind of applications, but they've also got one of the most popular curriculum platforms, something called Moodle. Um, it's basically it's a learning management system, it's called. It's where teachers can put their recorded lesson plans, the homework can be allocated through it. They've had it for a long while. In practice, it's only been used intermittently for some homework and a little teaching. And all of a sudden, um, the sysadmins are actually finding they're having to use this as the core of their teaching platform. And whereas before it might be fine to have Moodle running on your server, um, what you actually want for the end user, it's not just about delivering the application, it's about ensuring the availability and the service of the application. So suddenly we've got sysadmins who've essentially had something that was heavily underused, are suddenly having to face situations where actually at the start of the day at 9 a.m., um, you know, all students get allocated their work and start downloading all those um, files. They've also got a situation where you can't just have one server. We've got to have multiple servers and delivery points, because if you've got a single point of failure, you can wipe out the entire day's education for those children. And so all of a sudden, whereas before, if it went down overnight and they couldn't get the homework, well, we could just say hand the homework in a day later. Now it's become critical infrastructure. And I think that's the shift, that people are not thinking about, even with their traditional applications, they're having to think, actually, it's not just making the application available, it's making sure the application is always available and that it's always performant. That you don't have bottlenecks and half the lesson doesn't get streamed because everyone's trying to look at the same thing. So I think
Yeah.
it's an attitude that people have started thinking, I'm not actually just publishing apps or making software available on a specific machine. It's about, I'm having to provide a critical service.
Yeah, that's those are very good points. And this whole shift with, obviously, with today's environment, with the pandemic and everything else, has shifted our requirements for our IT applications, like you said, Rachel, where this in your case, distance learning, and in the corporate world, Ibrahim, corporate VPN and remote access to your company services, it's become very challenging because there's something that were nice to haves back in the previous days where they are must haves today. So, and the concept of this modern application and how we deliver that starts shifting also because we have, again, all these little components we have to deal with, and something that is challenging in some regards. And I think on both the small scale, like the small educational, like the small schools, and even on the large scale, like the corporates and even the large corporate financials and the banks and everything, is how do you shift to support this modern application architecture and deliver the experience that you're expecting? Like you said, Rachel, it's not about just making it available. You have to make sure that it's always available and resilient and available in a meaningful way. Because at the small scale, you have one or two people in your IT staff and they have to do everything. And then on the large scale, Ibrahim, at the corporate level, you talk about things like DevOps. I can tell you from my experience, DevOps is a great concept, but then converting your internal infrastructure with your traditional NetOps, your server development team, and your IT operations team, they're compartmentalized, and DevOps says, let's bring them all together and be one happy family. And it doesn't quite, it's not that easy to make that happen, right?
I agree with you totally. It's not that easy.
Yeah, let's spend a couple minutes talking about that migration and how that integrates with this concept of what we're doing with these modern applications. So, Ibrahim, from your perspective, how's that working in terms of large corporate environments being able to support this modern application evolution?
So, well, I always attend multiple. I attend other sessions as well. Recently, I was in VMUG, UK. So the trend again and the vibe we are getting around. Let me discuss a little bit around other colleagues and other V experts what they think. Definitely, it is unprecedented time at the moment, and we are seeing a rise of usage under VDIs, and end user computing arena. And not only that, people are demanding more resources on the VDIs. So that's definitely has been changed already. What more we are seeing is from the point of view of a DevOps application, which you mentioned, it is already a challenge, and it has always been challenging for sysadmin, because the usual talk when you have with the DevOps person is they need more compute, they need more resources. And we as VMware administrators or administrators in general, we can only do so much at a certain time. So that has always been a challenge. But because of the new infrastructure changes which we are trying to bring in to accommodate DevOps engineers, to give them the resources they need, especially with which I just mentioned about Cloud Foundation, that can ease up things to bridge those gaps really within the DevOps world and the sysadmin world. But it is definitely, as you mentioned before, quite challenging, and the fundamental problem sometimes becomes that they don't speak the same terminology which we speak, and sometimes you have people who don't understand the same terminology, the concept behind how we do things. Then we have to lay it down to a basic understanding and explain them. People who are smart, they understand it, and then we have a workaround for it. Quite often it's not the case. We have to develop a workaround for these things, and we end up having a workaround for this, a workaround for that, just to get things rolling, get things working and it never becomes a strategic solution. It becomes a tactical solution just to get things done. And that is always the case with any organizations. Even when I was working for BlackBerry and Orange, I have seen that in the past as well, and it is still a challenge for most of us.
Absolutely. And Rachel, you work a lot with the smaller scale organizations, right?
Well,
How's it for that?
I mean, when we talk about smaller scale, what we're typically talking about is I've been talking to one group of colleges. So it's a bit more like a school district where they've got multiple sites, and some of those might be quite small. So with full and part-time students, they've got about 20,000 students, and then the staff on top. And that's actually supported by essentially a head of IT and 3 assistants, some of whom are part-time. And so these folks have to do everything literally from running around a campus, plugging in a new cable. It's what they do is pretty resetting the student logins when half the kids forget their login every single day for the last 14 weeks. Um, and actually, their applications are, as I said, really, really mainstream, the kind of thing that any organization who's not an IT business. So even the sysadmins probably have never come across DevOps or Kubernetes or anything like that. We're talking when Microsoft applications like Word, PowerPoint, SharePoint, um, curriculum platforms like Moodle, that kind of thing. And for these kind of guys, to be honest, they don't really want to know how your product works. Um,
Yeah,
they
definitely.
basically want to say, I've got this problem, I need high availability, I've got this many users with this much throughput, I don't know anything about load balancing, I know I need a load balancer, I just want to buy. Quite often they want to buy the physical version, the physical appliance. I want to buy a box, stick it in, and I want it to kind of just work. And actually, that's one of the things. It was something that actually when I was at Citrix, we introduced into the HDX protocol. We introduced predefined templates, and this is something that's particularly helpful. Like I know your product's got defined templates, and like there is even thankfully a specific
Yeah,
one for Moodle, so that I can go along and say I'm running an Exchange server of version whatever from Microsoft. How do I configure this load balancer? And I don't really have to know. I can load in and say, this is the settings. um, so that is actually what a lot of organizations, because if you're a shoe company, you might have one IT guy and an assistant, but you might have 20,000 users who have to check the shoe inventory. So you can have a lot of traffic, but actually very, very simple applications.
Absolutely. And I thank you for that little pitch there. And you're absolutely correct. And I think we all agree. People don't necessarily want to learn, for example, or know all the details, for example, load balancing technology. I have always said load balancing technology is kind of a niche field in IT because it's not networking. It's not your layer 2, 3 routing switching environment. And it's not your server application development environment where you're coding and writing your content, but it's somewhere in between because it takes pieces of both of them. So there aren't a lot of people that fit in that load balancing field. So you're absolutely right, Rachel, where a lot of people don't want to or aren't interested in or aren't aware of knowing about load balancing technology, and having the ability to make it simple and using things like templates for your common applications, like your Exchange, like your Moodle, like your other types of applications is absolutely essential, not only for the small, but also even for the larger environments, because I mean, I can tell you, for example, any large corporate environment, they could have literally hundreds of applications that they're load balancing. So for somebody to be an expert at all of that is really almost
amazing.
impossible, right? This really
Yeah,
is. So, and then tying back into these things like this concept of this modern application again, we're going from this monolithic structure to this exploded structure of these services and microservices. Now we have containers using some technology, maybe it's Docker or something else. And we also now have these other technologies where we might be using virtual machines and hypervisors. It sounds like it's a lot more complicated than the old school monolithic application. And the reality is it is more complicated. There's a lot more technologies we have to learn. There's a lot more pieces and a lot more integration and interaction we have to deal with. So now we have to know about Kubernetes. We're talking about containers in terms of orchestration, and we need to tie that all together, and we need to become experts at all that. It's really, really hard to do. So let's spend maybe a couple minutes and going back to Ibrahim, talking about what does it take for us to take advantage of this modern application environment, because we're doing it for a reason. And the reason is, I think you said at the very beginning, is we want the flexibility, we want some agility, we want the ability to, instead of having to do patch updates every 6 months where there are 100 changes, we can do little things here, little things there, little things here, and these different pieces. It gives a lot more flexibility in terms of load balancing and application availability. We talked about there's some advantages in terms of providing more site resiliency and server resiliency. But how do we incorporate all this complexity into what we're trying to do today?
So it starts by going back to the basics, having going back to your single monolithic application and designing the same web server on a dedicated, server, and then what you do then is, create multiple of these web servers, and then do the same for middleware. And then you create a cluster on the database, because you are actually running a database on the same server. If that single server goes down, your environment is down. So that's the big risk here, right? So what we are trying to do is spread these components, the web server, the middleware, and the database. Make your database highly available by having a cluster of servers running underneath. On top, you can have your middle. Well, again, on the second layer, you have your middleware, which you don't want a single point of failure. So you have multiple servers running the code. It involves a lot of testing. It involves a lot of, so it's funny how things, when you try to move from a single application or a single server, then you will end up having, development environment, first a test environment to test everything is working. So you have 3 servers for your test environment, one with web server, one with, the middleware and DB, but you can't just have one. So you have to have a cluster of them. So you have a cluster of test, and then you have a cluster of development environment. So all of a sudden these VMs keeps adding, these virtual machines keeps adding, but for a good cause. The good cause is eventually when you get to live, you have everything working in your test, your dev, and your production environment. And you also don't want to have everything running on your one side. So you might be thinking of having a cloud infrastructure as well. So then you want to replicate the live environment in the cloud as well. So that if you have an issue connecting to one of your sites, you have the exact replica running as a DR site, or maybe just extra site running the same code to have extra capacity. We often find this at festive periods near Christmas time. We have a lot of websites we sell products gets overloaded, and you can easily, if you're in that model, or if you're in that mindset and you have your application toned in that fashion, it's quite easy for you to spin up web servers. And so as opposed to scaling up, which is increasing the memory just to take the load, you can scale out and increase the number of virtual machines just to get more to handle more traffic coming in. Does it make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And going to you, Rachel, it makes a lot of sense to me, because what Ibrahim is saying there, and I think it would apply, for example, going back to the educational use case, the ability to replicate and duplicate quickly and easily would seem to make a lot of sense in the educational environment, and especially with challenges that you mentioned in terms of IT resources and things like that. How do these things in terms of getting the humans interacting and knowing the technology work for what you've experienced?
I think what's been really fascinating about this whole coronavirus situation, particularly in education, is it's completely unlike any kind of deployment I've ever done before. Because usually I've worked with customers who've made a decision, we want to go to a remote working system. They've already got the software they're using, their way of interacting. We have these kind of meetings. We just need something to run it on and things like that. This is completely the opposite, that we're suddenly going to ask teachers and educators to start doing digitized content, um, online delivery, and this is something they've never done before. And what we're actually talking about a lot is we're not talking about networking, we're talking about the application load. And it's been a bit of a, I don't know what it's been like in the US, but in the UK we just don't really have remote schools as it was anyway, so there's very, very little benchmark or data in the market. So people have been just trying anything to keep their classes running. You quite often see teachers using Zoom with kind of 30 little tiny little webcams of kids staring back at them, which is
Yeah.
actually very costly bandwidth wise. So what's been fascinating is that the IT guys are actually interacting more with the management and the leadership teams of these schools and colleges, because they're actually having to say, well, we're getting all this kind of network traffic, who's using what, and um, actually what is the demand. If I put a stream lesson up, is this an efficient way of delivering content? Does this make sense when the kids might only have a mobile phone at home? So actually, the insight into how the demands on the applications is actually partly feeding back and actually changing actually what is good curriculum content. How should teachers be using Zoom or Teams or whatever they're using? And
Yeah.
so that actual kind of insight into, oh, suddenly at 9 a.m. I get this surge, and it's a set of users who've never looked at that kind of data before. Um, and also don't have an established way of working. So for me as a solution architect, it's been really fascinating seeing the whole kind of like design model turned upside down.
Oh yeah, and you bring up an extremely good point that we haven't discussed yet, and I want to spend a few minutes on this and go back to you, Rachel. It's the whole concept of visibility and analytics, because that's a hot topic in IT industry in general already. But this is even more so important in terms of how do we know what to manage and how to manage it, because we have to have that visibility. And I'll throw in the little chime here also. The great thing about load balancing technology is because it acts as that central pivot point within the application architecture and the application flow. It collects lots of really cool metrics that it can help to make that decision. But you really need that information. You really want that information to make that decision. And so, I mean, are there things that you have seen that you've been doing or that your customers have been doing, Rachel, in terms of this modern application concept and being able to collect analytics from all these components?
I mean, that's certainly been a kind of a bit of a kind of research project that a lot of these institutions are having to look at who's using what. And the really weird thing is we've actually looked at who's not doing what. So you could
All
have
right.
different departments in schools, and you can see that actually 90% of the traffic is coming from the computer science teacher, and that you start questioning, well, how much interaction, because we're dealing with end users who've had no training on remote working or remote communication, and these for the education sector, it's really just like corporate training or education, but people who've literally never seen unified communications before. Um, People have got very fixated on the video, And so that's one metric we look at very heavily, is how much video is going on. Because actually video can be a very poor way, particularly with a large group, of interact. The amount of information, it can actually be quite overwhelming, um, if you've just got dozens of little heads that aren't adding anything.
Yeah,
Um, and
I know what you mean.
actually, when you think about what happens in a normal classroom, a lot of the time the teacher will spend maybe only 5 minutes, because that's the concentration span, explaining something on a whiteboard. Um, so actually looking at how much traffic and how much the applications are being used can give you a very good idea of how much teaching's going on, and actually target you can see the outliers, and you can say, well, what is this person doing? Why are they generating this demand, and why is this department so quiet? So it's been very interesting from that point of view.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to throw it to you, Ibrahim. How have you seen this concept of, again, less than a concept, but more of a direction of getting analytics and taking advantage of analytics in these environments, especially from the larger corporate environments that you've dealt with?
So again, they are very important. So we need to have insight on what's going on at any point. Seeing the trend recently, like there are a number of applications. I don't want to name any really, but it does go without saying that having a good monitoring and analytic platform is a must for any organization really, and it keeps them ahead of getting getting into a major bottleneck per se. Also, there are tools available which does analytics and predictive sort of analytics, which people use, and they can get more data from there. And but again, I say about predictive analytics, but with the unprecedented time, everything is all the charts which were in trend is completely out of the picture now, right? Because things have changed completely, which used to be in a specific trend, and now it's completely different. But monitoring again is a very important thing for any organization, and it is good to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize. My dog just came up to my chair and had to be on the
That's
video
so
here.
cute.
So I
Yeah,
apologize
hello.
for Brewster. But so yeah, absolutely. So I think this has been so far a very awesome discussion that we've had here, and we've covered lots of different topics. And I would love to spend the next probably 6 hours talking about more things with you guys. But unfortunately, we need to keep everybody else in mind and let them do some real work, and myself as well, probably as well also. And I just want to add a couple comments here, and then throw it to you guys for some last minute pieces. And for me, this has been interesting because it's talking a lot about what Kemp is doing in terms of load balancing. Makes a lot of sense in terms of this direction of this modern application of the services. And the load balancing technology is still critical, because now there are more components to load balance to provide that availability within sites, the scalability, the analytics that we talk about, and the multi-site for the geographic redundancy, and also the simplicity. We talk a lot about making these more complex things that we're building and trying to make it simple with the templates and pieces like that. And one thing I do want to throw out, by the way, is we just announced at Kemp, for example, that we now have introduced a new templates for doing VDI load balancing, what we call for Citrix virtual applications and desktops with Citrix Storefront for VDI as a new template. And that was just announced recently as an example to show more of the robustness that we're trying to do to support the applications that our businesses are trying. So let's go back to you guys again for one quick comment or summary of your thoughts here. And Ibrahim, I'll go to you first again, and we'll let Rachel finish. But Ibrahim, any last thoughts here?
Well, modern application is a broad topic which we discussed today. I think the final thoughts which I would say is this is for web admins, and I guess this is for all the administrators, right? So they need to be keeping a closer eye on what can they do, what can they change, what can they improve. There's a lot happening in the technology space, and things are changing quite fast. And they need to understand new technology quicker and faster to be keeping up with the technology. So this is what I would say. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And Rachel, any last comments from you about this?
I think the whole recent situation over the last few months, I've become increasingly aware that if you know you need functionality, and you know what you want it to do, if you're having to spend an awful lot of time um, trying to understand a product to evaluate it, and it's disproportionate to the resource you've got available, which for a lot of these colleges it is that head of IT, and he's also got to worry about how he's going to get laptops or out to all those kids, and how he's going to reset the passwords for today and things like that. Is that actually really look at, it's not just feature lists and functionality, it's how easy is this product to maintain ongoing, um, and actually run. How much hassle is a product going to be in your environment? Because you can get some very, very complex technologies um, that have a very high learning curve, and you might have to spend a lot on training, or actually even have a
Yeah.
dedicated networking expert. And that just the kind of budgets that are in education, that's not feasible or sensible. So I think it's look at a product, what you get in terms of documentation, support, how easy out of the box, and how easy is it to understand.
Yeah. And
Um,
also
you know,
maintain it, right? Yeah,
yeah, and
maintaining it is going to be a challenge. If it is going to be too hard to implement, then I guess obviously it's going to be difficult to keep it running, to maintain it, to update it. So that is a very interesting topic
and
which you have
and
started.
also I think it's also about vendor stability. Um, this whole thing has seen, we've seen a lot of small niche software companies suddenly become really hot and expand, and that they might have expanded from 10 million users to 300 million, and a lot of those users are free, and there are a lot of fairly new niche software. People aren't thinking very hard about when they're choosing their software or their vendors, and actually what happens if this vendor, with the current economic climate, hits problems in a few months. Look at how long your vendor's been established, um, and if they've got real paying customers and have managed to do that for a good few years. um, that's one takeaway I take away, because there are certainly some cloud service providers who are looking pretty flaky at the moment.
Oh, I completely agree with you, and I agree with all your points there in
Yeah.
terms of picking the right vendor, finding something that's simple, finding something that works, and Ibrahim, absolutely, in terms of tying it all together and getting all these pieces together. This has been a great conversation, folks. Again, I wish I had more time to chat with you, and I know probably offline we'll be discussing more things, and I'm sure we'll be catching up. But thank you for everybody who joined in for this LinkedIn Live Kemp Live presentation of Unlocking the Modern Application Experience. Again, my name is Frank Yue with Kemp Technologies, and we are here with Rachel Berry and Ibrahim Quraishi, our internet experts, technology experts, who have given us a wealth of information. And again, thank you very much. And everybody, I appreciate it, and look forward to listening to another conversation when we do another Kemp Live. Kemp Live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting
Thank
me.
you.
Cheers.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye.